Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. All right, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, as always, Shane Lemaster. We're here for episode 61 with very special guest, Dr. James Fadiman. And do you prefer if I call you Dr. Fadiman, or is it okay to call you Jim or James?
Jim would probably be easiest for both of us.
Okay, great. So very, in my opinion, very high esteemed guest to have you on today. I want to thank you for your time. I know it's very valuable. You're a very busy man. And I'm trying to do my part in order to spread some of this important knowledge about what it means to be human and what it means to have a consciousness, and get more people to start thinking about these questions that I think underlie everything else that we explore. And so my first question is the only standardized question that I have on the show, and that is, I'd actually like to start by quoting this first chapter that you sent me, this book chapter in Healthy Selves. Just the very first paragraph of chapter 1 says, all human beings, including those who are the healthiest and most successful, are composed of more than one self. When things are going well, each plays its rightful role as part of our harmonious symphony. We really are different people, or have different minds, parts, or personalities in different moments and in different contexts. And my only standardized question goes right along with that, and that is, what does the phrase conversations with the mind mean to you? That's the title of the show, and the audience knows what it means to me, but you have some deep insight into what this could mean for us.
Well, that's really wonderful, because obviously from what you read of our book, now called Your Symphony of Selves, is conversation within the mind, is that awareness that you have within you, several of you, and that they do talk to each other. And at one level, we have this problem with this book, which is, at one level, it's unbelievably obvious. If I say to someone, have you ever argued with yourself? And everybody says yes, and that other person, and people get, oh. Mm-hmm. The other level is that it is an obviousness which is absolutely denied by the conventional cultures, both in religion and in psychology. So we're putting out at one level this incredibly radical, that you are not a single unified boring self, and on the other hand, we're saying, since everybody knows this intuitively as soon as we mention it, how can we justify a very long book? So for us, conversations in the mind is the way it is, and conversation between minds, it can be rather large groups if you actually think about it.
Yeah, I've read some really impressive studies that, they'll sort of take crime statistics and link them up with national prayer days or national meditation days that certain countries hold, and see a drastic reduction in crime rates across the world on those days during those times. And I've had some collective experiences, both in sports as well as in, psychedelic circles, where the collective mind, the collective consciousnesses that come together have a very profound additive effect to each other in a lot of ways.
And we have some informal studies that were done when the Grateful Dead were touring, where large audiences, and I have a lot of reports from friends from around the country, is the feeling of being in a single mind, aided undoubtedly by lots of psychedelics in those concerts, but it was very, very palatable. People could really taste it in a way that they didn't in conventional life.
So if we can have this understanding and somehow get past our current stuckness to embrace this idea that we have many selves, What are some of the implications that you think could come from that on an individual level as well as for humanity?
Well, I'm not sure about humanity, particularly the current humanity, but individually, it's pretty straightforward. Is one of the things you think about. Think about someone who you know very well, perhaps you live with, perhaps you've been married to or been a parent or child of, and you notice that they're inconsistent, that they are sometimes they behave very differently, and you either are upset or you get mad at them or you are sorry for them. You have various ways you handle that, unless you begin to say, no, each self is consistent. I remember vividly visiting my mother when I was about 50. And she lived in Florida, and we're about to go out. And she said to me, "Don't you think you should put on a sweater?" And I thought, actually, in my 50 years of life, I have actually learned to know whether I would put on a sweater or not all by myself. And what I saw was this kind of mothering behavior, somewhat automatic. She had not very good circulation, so she would get chilled sooner than other people. So it was projection, and we just went on with that. And the visit didn't go terribly well. And I said something incredibly kind of mean and crummy to my stepfather. I said, "How do you stand living with her?" Mm-hmm. And he looked at me and he said, "She's only that way when you're here." And as I now reflect on that, what it was is she had a self which was linked to mothering. And we all, those of us with children, know that one. And when I would arrive, she slipped into it and would behave from that place. But it was her, definitely, but it was not the her that she was when she was with her husband. So what you begin to get, if you see the people you're close to as selves, when they're in a self that you're not comfortable with, that's just a part of them. And what we see is people become kinder to each other, genuinely compassionate. And then they begin to forgive themselves, because they say, "Gee, I can't, it's hard for me to imagine that I really said that to you last night." And the answer is the I who's apologizing didn't. Mm-hmm. So that you're beginning to get that there's a group in there, and your goal is not to smush them into what we call the single self fallacy, but to begin to harmonize, which is your goal is to be in the right self at the right time. So right now, you're in your kind of media intellectual self. Now, when you go out on the mat, that's not the self that could do a very good job. But the one on the mat is absolutely clear what it's doing, where its attention is, what its loves and fears are. And so, but when you come off the mat, it takes you probably a little while to not be that way, because it's really uncomfortable probably to be around you when you're in your martial arts self. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm a pretty happy-go-lucky guy when I'm in my martial arts environment, because the environment does that to me, and the people that I train with does that to me. Sure. But yeah, the idea of different selves definitely makes sense. And as a practicing therapist, I think when clients come to me and they ask me about this, or they talk to me about different parts of themselves speaking, I almost like to use metaphors to help people to understand this idea of not coalescing into this unified self, but almost like your self, big S, is this house or a cabin, and it has a round table with all these different versions of you around it, and each one has a say at the table, but who's doing most of the speaking? And with your examples, a question came up, and I was wondering if I can certainly see how we can switch between different selves based on who we're with. I can get together with a best friend I haven't seen since I was a kid, and I'll go right back into that adolescent Shane. But But is it possible too to have multiple voices, multiple versions of self emerging simultaneously, like in collaboration? Or is ideal, I'm big into optimal functioning. So is it perhaps ideal if we weren't unifying them into all one voice, but instead had perfect collaboration and compassion, like you said, across the table?
Well, that's the goal. That's where we're headed, which is, as I say, we called our book The Symphony of Selves to give the image, because when you listen to a symphony, you're listening to people playing totally different instruments, totally different tempos, with totally different notes, but they are also hearing each other, and they are cooperating in a way that gives you an overall effect that's impossible for any of the single groups or single players to achieve. So if you see a football team, what you're seeing is a lot of people with very specialized skills operating both independently and totally, if they're good, with awareness of each other. And that's true in any team sport. And so what we're looking at is the goal is to be a peaceful, unified, effective being who puts the right self at the right time. So, so at the moment, you and I are both in our media selves. Mm-hmm. For instance, I'm aware that I'm speaking in complete sentences. Now, I write fiction, and when you listen to actual human beings doing dialogue in the street or anywhere, their grammar is terrible. And it's one of the ways you differentiate kind of written speech from spoken speech, is that spoken speech is much messier. But when you're doing something like we're doing, which is a kind of cross between the two, you adjust into that mode. So that what we're saying is mental health is being in the right self at the right time, or now and then in the right selves at the right time. Though we find that more often in highly creative, successful people. Mm-hmm. They usually will say, of course, I know everything that you're talking about, and here's how it works for me. And we have in the book a wonderful essayist who writes about his, indeed, exactly your metaphor, his round table. Mm-hmm. And his job is to chair the meeting.
Right. Yeah. And I think that links up perfectly with, some other theories from other fields about executive functioning and things like that, literally using the word executive as a way to, in a metaphor, who's the chairman of the board. All the board members have a say in the process, but who is really doing the filtering?
And there are a lot of systems that talk about it, and even get very close to where we're talking. And then right at the end, they say, but really, 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 there's a single super or higher or more beautiful or something special self. And what we notice is at that point, they stop using evidence and they kind of go back to a kind of monotheism of self as a belief, not from knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think the conversation has to stop there. I'm learning right now in my social work PhD program all about different forms of knowledge, different ways of knowing, and I'm in social work, we're a social science, so we push hard in the idea that subjective knowledge is just as valid or just as important as objective, testable knowledge. And I think when we start to venture into the area of the spiritual and start to talk about these ethereal concepts that science hasn't caught up yet in how to, study it directly, people kind of either their ideas of evidence stop at quantitative, or I like to push these conversations a little more forward, bringing in personal experiences, near-death experiences, common experiences shared between people in all these altered states, to kind of move that conversation forward a little bit into the idea of subjective knowledge and the validity of that.
Well, science only makes one fundamental error, and it's the same error that religion makes. It says it's the only game in town. There's nothing wrong with science, and there's nothing wrong with objective, meaning someone else can see the same fact at the same time. And that's good for what you use it for. To use it, say, for, if someone says, well, you've told me your dream, but I know more than you do about your dream, we know that they have veered off of science into a kind of scientific irrationality. And William James has a great term, which is called the sentiment of rationality, meaning the feeling that I'm being rational. And I'll give you the example that I love, which is you're quarreling with someone and they say, let's be rational about this. And what I've taught people, taught couples, thousands of couples, is to say, okay, we'll be rational for 5 minutes and then we'll be irrational. And I say to them, don't worry, it won't take 5 minutes. Because people immediately who are being, quote, rational, get upset because what you've just done was call their game, which is they're saying, I want to have this argument in a realm in which I know how to play, even though that's just, that won't work because you're not going to play in that realm. And if we're going to talk about, if we're arguing, we're already in the realm of feelings. We're already have left, quote, rationality. And I think James caught it beautifully by saying it's a feeling. And I know lots of people in the sciences who if you push them, they say, I like that feeling. You know, if someone says to me, well, something about your research, but what's the percentage of people who such and such? And I say, that's really important to you, isn't it? And they say, well, yes, it is. and then we could go in that direction. Usually they get very uncomfortable because their fantasy is that facts that cannot be refuted, like 2 and 2 is 4, in certain systems, are somehow a superior form of knowledge. And remember, I started this little rap by saying this is similar to religion. And the thing about certain religions, Christianity being the most egregious, is the notion that there is only one truth. We have it. And if you don't have it, you're a bad person. And I see it's identical to scientists who are caught in only having a rational mode.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, it speaks directly to the dualism that I think we're stuck in. You know, if you don't hold my beliefs, then you're wrong. That's a big root of the problem. Getting back to, you know, issues that are kind of difficult for scientists to wrap their heads around. I was hoping that you could speak a little bit to transpersonal psychology and your efforts in the beginning to bring this about. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and in social work, there's a few publications on transpersonal uses, but it has largely been left out of social work practice. You know, as a therapist in my training, I was told to avoid spiritual concepts, don't talk about them with your clients. And from my own experiences, I know how powerful and life-shaping those can be for me, which is why I'm exploring mystical experiences in my dissertation. But I was wondering if you could speak to transpersonal psychology and how it can like play a role in current thinking.
Well, let me go back a step, because the metaphor of you shouldn't talk about spiritual things with your clients. Now let's go back, and now you're a Victorian psychotherapist. And of course you're told, don't talk about anything sexual with your clients, because that's offensive and will disturb them. And you, as a good Victorian psychotherapist, are clear that that's an area which we don't talk about. But as a human being, we know that if you don't talk about sexuality, you're going to miss a lot of what's going on in a human being. The identical argument is for spiritual experience. one of the few groups that ever imagines that spiritual experience is linked to psychopathology are psychologists. And it is one of the central criticisms that psychology deals with, which is to train people to not look at some area of experience is on the surface, on the rational surface, total nonsense. That's like saying, don't talk about anything you do with your left hand, because we know that the left hand in history is the sinister, the sinistra, the hand that does bad things. So we're not going to talk about it. And your client will say, I'm going to pay you for that kind of nonsense. So that's a kind of, just so we know where I'm coming from. So there's no tolerance here. So transpersonal psychology came out of that awareness that we were missing a huge part of human experience. And that part of human experience mattered in every culture that has ever existed. And we were in the one culture called the scientific culture where it was being denied. And it was no different than the Victorian repression of sexuality. What people are worried about from the therapist's point of view is that people who have spiritual experiences are talking about different truths. And if someone has been saved from sin by accepting Jesus Christ, they are not worse, better, or different than someone who says, my ayahuasca, the plant, speaks to me and gives me advice about my friendship patterns. We're simply saying to people, what is your experience? And if I'm a therapist, the problem that I see is, how is your experience not serving you? And could it be that you have beliefs such as, I have to be a unified self, that simply make it harder for you to find real reality? So that reality has to be larger than, quote, objective reality or psychodynamic reality or Freudian reality or behaviorist reality. These are all subsets. And the subset are all subsets of consciousness. And the way I look at belief systems, psychotherapeutic belief systems, religious belief systems, scientific belief systems, and it's a metaphor which I hope is okay, is they're all flavors of ice cream. And what we know is there are people who will argue that butter brickle is superior to strawberry. And they can get fairly heated up about it, but we know beneath that, they both agree that it's all ice cream. And so when I'm working with someone, I'm very comfortable with that it's all ice cream. So if someone says to me, I have a voice inside me that tells me that stealing is acceptable, and therefore I keep stealing, and I'm with you because the courts have sent me to you because I keep getting arrested for stealing, even though I have this voice inside me that says it's okay. So the problem that I'm now with is not, do you have a voice inside you? Because they do. The point is their voice is giving them very bad advice. Now, I know people who listen to, showing my own bias here, say Fox News, and I think they get fairly bad advice. And they think I get bad advice, but we all agree that it's news. So the transpersonal says, let's look at the whole of human experience, which includes what's, quote, called the paranormal, angelic voices, spirit possession, clairvoyance, or what I love is people who can see the future, because that really threatens the rational world the most, that the future can be in some sense known, which means it already has occurred. That's hard for people. And actually that's hard for me too. But those are the ones I get stuck on.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting, being a practitioner for a while now and now going back into academia, I get to explore my own practice from a different lens and my experience from a different lens. And what I'm noticing in practice is that so many of my clients want to bring spiritual issues into therapy. And luckily, I mean, I'm comfortable with that. You know, I kind of go against what I've been taught in that sense. I know how important it is for me. But what sort of damage do you think? I mean, it seems to me very apparent the damage that is being done by, you know, in the education of these counselors, telling them to ignore these aspects of self. You know, the spiritual is super important. I think in the first, in this book right here, I don't know if you can see it, Eminent Elders. Yeah. You wrote a chapter in that as well. And you spoke about your early days co-teaching a course on consciousness at Harvard. And you talk specifically about the best and highest a human can be in these different domains: psychological, philosophical, mysticism, and personal experience. I was wondering if that ties in with what we're talking about here with transpersonal and some of the potentials, but also some of the damages that are being done by leaving some of those aspects of self out. We're not allowing ourselves, we're kind of putting a cap on what our human potential is by limiting our beliefs, and by, you know, we're putting the governor on ourselves.
Well, we get those governors at an early age. And among the other things I taught was a whole course on, quote, affirmations or goal setting, or using positive statements. And what I'd say to people is, in your childhood, you were told who you were. You're the nice, particularly if you have siblings, you're the nice one, you're the smart one, you're the mean one. And who taught you that? Well, these giant beings, much more important than God, which were your parents, because God kind of leaves you alone. But your parents tell you when to get up, when to sleep, what to eat, how to swallow, and what to wear, who you can talk to. So they're really powerful. They also can hit you. Okay? So imagine your parent says to you, "You're really stupid." Okay? And you think, "I don't feel stupid." However, God, these deities have told me I'm stupid. I better begin to conform to the reality that I've been told. Or I'm not as nice as my sister. And when I work with a group of people, sometimes I'll say, "Who among you was the good child?" And, you know, people raise their hands. And then I say, "Who among you was the bad child?" And the other group raise their hands. But they always smile. Okay? And I know why they're smiling, because bad children have more freedom than good children. Okay, so they get this from their parents, that you are the one who both can do what's right, but you also can do what's wrong. So you actually have a wider range of activities in your life than your goody two-shoes sister or brother. And that's why they're smiling. And when I say that, they all laugh, and the ones who've been good children have this moment where they realize that part of their childhood was taken away from them. Because once they were told they were good, in a situation where it was ambiguous, they would go only in one direction, and they would miss opportunities. So when you begin to talk that way, then you're giving back people their freedom. You're saying to the, quote, children who are, quote, bad, you actually had a wider range of possibilities than your parents. And to the good children, you're saying it's not too late. Okay. And I was just thinking, I just read a very lovely article that said, taking psychedelic mushrooms cured my atheism. Okay. And it's someone who was in one of these very legal, super cool, realistic studies, reasonable, recent studies in depression. And this young woman, who had been a very serious atheist, got in touch with what she called kind of greater, divinity, kind of the great force, the undifferentiated wholeness of humanity, or of universe. And she indicated that her depression lifted, but also she had this huge shift in her belief system, which was bigger than the old one. And the nice part about transpersonal psychology is it's simply bigger than the psychologies that it grew out of. Just as psychology itself grew out of philosophy and religion, because they were, in a sense, systems, and they weren't dealing much with individual differences. Psychology dealt with individual differences, and then it began to deal with people who weren't winning in the social world. And in certain countries, for instance, being an extrovert makes you a little out of place. And in other cultures, being an introvert makes you out of place. There's nothing good or bad about being an introvert or an extrovert, but it is useful to be able to know when to be which.
Yeah, I like how you said transpersonal psychology is bigger than its constructs that it's built upon. I think it leaves a lot of opening and creates a lot of safe space for people to be able to talk about some of those issues that are so profound. One of those being the mystical experience. And I was hoping to talk to you a little bit about that and pick your brain. A big part of my dissertation, and probably my biggest influencer of why I'm even choosing this path, is to explore some of those questions. I mean, I've had some of those mystical experience, peak experience, higher state of consciousness type experience where you kind of break through, and there is this experience of the divinity, the connectedness of everything, but that we are a part of that connectedness. And it brings me to the questions, is that a collective consciousness? Are we these individual fractalized consciousness that need to just realize that we're part of this bigger consciousness? And I think that the mystical state opened that up for me personally, and that's what I'd like to put my effort into. I know a lot of people have studied, high dose psychedelic sessions can elicit these states quite frequently, and the long-term benefits to well-being come from those mystical experiences themselves. But there's not much research being done into the facilitators of these mystical experiences, like what specific setting, both internal and external, could be helping to precipitate mystical experiences in some people and some in not, or even within the same person. I'm trying to get more people more mystical experiences, if that makes sense, because it is so important in my personal life to help me feel connected, help me feel like I have meaning and purpose, like I have, like my consciousness means something.
Right. Well, not only your consciousness means something, but it is a tiny infinitesimal bit of consciousness. So it also means, in the Buddhist sense, it also means nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When the Buddhists say you have no self, they're not really saying you have no self. They're saying you have the same self that not only everyone does, but all the trees and all the rocks have, because the universe is composed of self.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have that experience, someone else looks at you and what I just said, and they go, uh-huh, uh-huh. And if they hadn't had that experience, they look at you and think, I wonder how soon I can leave this room, and will this being attack me?
Mm-hmm.
Because the mystical experience simply breaks apart the illusion of separation. I mean, if I'm sitting here in California, and I'm sitting on a chair. Now the chair is separate from me, but not exactly. And if we actually look at the atomic level, what we see is a lot of individual atoms of me are going into the chair, and a lot of the chair's atoms are floating in the surface of me. So there's actually at the physics level, not even at the quantum physics level, just at the atomic level, an interpenetration of things. And I just recently was seeing a fantastic film called actually Fabulous Fungi.
I saw that.
And one line in it has stuck with me. It's a woman, mycologist, talking about the amount of spores that are in the atmosphere. And she said, for example, in the last breath you took, you inhaled about 10 fungal spores. And I thought, whoa. So we and fungi are in this incredible game. If should we continue breathing, we're in it. So the experience of not being separate is enormously relieving. And the first, in some sense, children start by not being separate. They then learn that their physical form has separation. It's at the level of separation, so that if they're hungry, their twin being fed doesn't affect them. So there is a level where the separate beings do operate, and that's good to know. But as soon as you assume that that separation is at the next level, then you get in trouble. See, then you say, I am separate from, and then you begin to either be lonely, or you develop a small group, like we're the people who know truth. And the people who don't know truth are bad. And so, in fact, if they really don't know truth, it's okay to hurt them. And if they're the wrong, quote, religion, meaning if they think God is a different flavor than I think God is, it's okay to kill them. What I've found, if you say to people, I've never found anyone who's taken me up on this, if there's separation, would you, for instance, take a hammer and hit your own hand? And they say, no, I wouldn't do that. And you say, why? You say, it's my hand. You say, well, if other people are part of you, does that apply the same way? And then we have a discussion. So when someone says, I hate someone, what they're saying is, I'm creating a separation. And going back to the selves, it's very hard to hate all of someone, right? There's a wonderful Chinese saying, is there's no such thing as a bad person. And the example they give is, you're passing by a well and you see a child fall into the well. And they say, everyone will stop and pull the child from the well. No one is so bad. And why are you pulling the child from the well? It's not your child. Maybe it's not your village, but you have a connection to that child. And you know that without having to ask yourself. And so the illusion of separation is necessary for some kinds of functioning and not necessary for important human interaction. It gets in the way.
Yeah, and if you know, and I think of the mystical experience as kind of you know, it's much bigger than it underlies all religious underpinnings, right? That's what all these stories come from, are from people actually having these mystical experiences and then coming back and sharing it. And if the mystical state helps to remind us that we are all connected, it would make sense that that we want to get more people to have more mystical experiences in one way or another. So with all your explorations with high dose sessions, in all different contexts, what do you see as some of the additional correlates of mystical or peak experiences besides just the dosage of the molecule?
Well, the thing about a psychedelic, and there are other ways of getting there, but that's the one I know best, is it's an opener. However, you open into the situation you're in, and you're very, very sensitive to it. So when we talk about a set or setting, meaning what's your emotional likelihood, what's your anticipation, what's your intention, that turns out to be very critical. Also, the situation you're in. I remember someone writing me a wonderful little comment when I was doing some research, which is, the psychedelic session really was going wonderfully until the car caught on fire. Okay? Now, all of a sudden, the setting has gotten very difficult. And it's very hard, to be in the I love all humanity and I am a flower and you are a tree, when somebody's got to do something so you don't all get killed. So you have to pull yourself back into the situation of being a separate being and deal with it. And you may not come back out of that. Now, what we're finding is when people have what they call bad trips, which we're replacing that, by the way, with the word challenging. The reason is because in reflection, most people indicate they got more total learning about how to be in this world out of the difficult trip, the challenging trip, than, quote, good ones. Now, I'm not sure that one needs to suffer to learn, but it's out there. And so the mystical experience, well, there's an early, if we take an earlier one, and I used to say to people who were stuck on a belief, I said, your beliefs change. They're the most flexible part of you. And I say, for instance, and I'm talking now to a bunch of adults, does anyone remember when they knew that if someone put their tongue in your mouth, and they all kind of, you watch this reflection, of course we all felt that was really, at the very least, yucky, depending on our vocabulary. And yuck! And then we found out, as our hormones changed, that our belief system changed. And what you begin to notice is if your belief systems are changing, and you go back 10 or 15 years and say, gee, I believe this, but I now believe the opposite, what makes you think that the belief you have now is any more stable or, quote, better than the one you gave up? So that what I say to people is, what you're after is beliefs that serve you. For instance, I think that people are basically good. That's a belief system. Now, as a result, I get cheated, I get phone scammed, I sometimes even will respond when my computer says, we found a virus and all you have to do is press here and we will trap you into it. However, I think it's a healthier way to live to think that most people are good, because people tend to respond to your belief system as well. So a practical application of the kind of unity of all beings is to treat people that way, which evokes in them the part of them that knows. See, there's a question we get into as well. Do we really need more people having mystical experiences because we've had them and we think we're better people? And then you say, well, does the system of consciousness demand self-knowledge? And the answer is maybe. And I look, for instance, at a species who I like better at the moment than human beings, which is trees. They cooperate with each other, they help each other, they also help different species, which we could learn a lot from. And the question is, do they have a mystical experience, or do they not need it? Mm-hmm. Do they already live in a universe of motion and togetherness and cooperation where it's part of the way they simply are? So we may be actually that Christian myth. We may have left the garden and fallen not into ignorance because we didn't get the tree of knowledge. And so mystical experience is one of the ways we get back to the garden. But we don't all have to get back. We have to watch out that we're not saying to people, just as my right-wing Christian friends say, if I say, you're not saved until you have had the mystical experience, and I happen to have this psychedelic drug which will get you 5 to 20 years in some states, but it's really good that you have it and have my experience. So we have to watch out for the same spiritual bigotry among us enlightened, wonderful, new age people as we find in all those terrible people who don't agree with us.
Yeah, and that's what I think I like the most about the mystical experience, is how individualistic it is. I mean, my experiences are different from yours, and they're all based largely around our belief systems. I mean, I see visions of Buddha and things like that, and someone of a Christian faith will see different imagery and archetypes and things like that. But it seems like, and you're right, I don't think everyone needs the mystical experience. It just seems like a good way to get people to realize or to wake up that they are connected to those that they even, hate parts of, and they should probably start looking at themselves. I always try and reflect on myself. Like if I come across somebody and I'm perturbed by them in some way, I'm usually quick to ask myself, well, what part of me is being reflected in them that I'm not liking, and is this a part of myself that I need to examine? And so I'm consciously aware of that, but I don't know how many people out there are pushing themselves in these ways to move forward towards that. The breaking of the conditioning that we all have growing up here in the West.
Well, it's tricky because I actually totally share your belief, which is I think more people have returned to the experience that they had before birth. That would be valuable. That makes them into better people. However, the universe may not agree with me. Okay? What I've noticed now and then when I ask the universe something and it says, "Do you really think you're going to understand these?" And I go, and I recall very vividly, the image really is you go to a coral reef. A coral reef has maybe 10,000 different species. And you find some being that lives on that reef, has lived on that reef for generation after generation. It's a parrotfish. And you catch this parrotfish and you say, "Can you describe the ecology of the reef?" The parrotfish looks at you and says, "I have a brain smaller than a peanut. What would make you think I understand the ecology of the reef?" Okay? And then I step back and I say, "I've had the mystical experience. I understand the way the universe is put together." And I hear a voice saying, "Hello, parrotfish. Are you kidding?"
Mm-hmm.
Okay? You can't even solve aging. Okay? You still think your personality exists. You don't have the faintest thing. You don't know anything about anything. And having had the mystic experience, it's true, you're nicer. And one of the things that I know, I do a lot of facilitating of groups. And several times I've facilitated a group of researchers, psychedelic researchers, each one of whom is a leader, is smart, is kind of a slightly arrogant, has had these experiences. And they are the easiest group to work with I have ever dealt with. They are the fastest to get off of it if it isn't working. No blame, and move the conversation or the exercise or what we're doing into a different place. And because I remember the first time I was going to work with them, I was asked by MAPS to do it after one of their giant conferences. And I thought, this is going to be really hard because these are all the people who lead such groups or who, run very big organizations.
High expectations.
And they just said, "We're here to cooperate with each other, period." And I worked with enough classy groups as a consultant in industry and so forth to know the difference. So one of the things I can say about the mystical experience, at least in the psychedelic group, is they're nicer. They're less committed to their belief and more committed to being of value. Now, if I deal with people who have achieved a mystical experience through a particular religious lens, they may or may not be able to let go of the lens. And I'll give you the example which probably has made me more tolerant for longer. So this is the major psychedelic experience very early in my career. And I'm in infinite something, darkness perhaps, and there's a point of light. And it's very attractive. It's very, very attractive. And I am drawn to it. And literally, I am flying towards this light. And it's feeling better and better, somehow as if it is loving me. And I see in front of me Jesus. And my own background is sufficiently agnostic at that point that that's disturbing. I think, okay, I mean, love, pouring, light, Jesus, okay. And I go right by Jesus. And I look back, and Jesus is actually like a stage prop. You can see the 2x4s and the canvas from the back. And I turn and I go towards the light. And I realize that around that periphery where there's Jesus, there's also a cutout of Buddha and of Allah and of Zoroaster and Moroni, the angel of Mormon, so forth and so on. And so what I get is all of these figures who are like gates or doorways. They are different doorways, but once you open the door, it's the same light. And so that's given me a very tolerant isn't the right word, because tolerant is I can accept you, but that I get that every door opens. If every door opens to the same place, you don't worry about whether people are going in the door you like. And that's probably where the mystical experience has been most valuable.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm wondering too if, so belief systems definitely shape your experience, but differing belief systems don't necessarily mean one person over another will achieve more mystical experiences or of greater quality. Are there other potential precipitory factors to elicit the mystical experience, such as like expectation that you're going to achieve it? I'm also playing with the idea, and it's more of a statistical term, but regression to the mean. So the further down the spectrum of depression you are, say with treatment-resistant depression being at some of the lowest, then that might make your potentiality for having a mystical experience higher than somebody who would come in with a baseline depression score or no depression score. So different things that we might be able to explore, that I could ask some of the participants as far as what to explore are some of the precipitating factors.
Well, in a funny way, it's like there's it's harder to climb a mountain if you're out of shape, but you can climb the mountain. Mm-hmm. And from the top, it doesn't matter how difficult it was. So remember that article I mentioned of the person who got over her atheism? That was taking a high dose of LSD, of psilocybin at Johns Hopkins for continual deep depression. But what the Hopkins people also note, and what we knew even in the 60s, is you're much more likely to retain the benefits of a psychedelic experience if there's a breakthrough to mystical awareness. We also probably had a lot of theories about that, but they were unimportant because the reality was very simple. If you get to the top of the mountain and you see the view, you can never unsee that view. If you don't get to the top of the mountain, the view is pretty good from part way up, and you make a lot of improvements. So I think the question of will people who are more depressed find it harder to get a mystical experience? The answer might be yes. But with psychedelics, one of the ways you make it easier for people to get a mystical experience is mechanically raise the dose. So that at the place where the personal is left behind and the transpersonal is the realm you're in, there's no difference between people. So that Mother Teresa and me are identical when we both let go of our personalities. Mm-hmm. Once we have personalities, she's a saint and I'm not. And we're all clear about that. And here's one of the little tricks, which is the Buddhists say your goal in these 10 or 20 or 30 years of meditation is to get into this place of no self. The only way you can get into the place of no self is that the self, which has been doing all that meditating, doesn't get any of that benefit. Okay? So you Me, who's sitting on my mat till my are paralyzed with arthritis, will never have that experience. Only by my being willing to not have that experience can that experience happen to the being.
So the ability to let go of expectation or even let go of outcome can have a significant impact. I think what I was saying with the rebound effect is more like the more severe PTSD you have or the more severe depression you have, it could make it more likely that you have a breakthrough experience. And I love your metaphor for getting people to the summit, or the journey to the summit. And you're right, if you're out of shape, there's going to be more of those challenging experiences that are going to be beneficial along the way. The view's the same from the top, but if we can help maybe with a new kind of rope or a new kind of system to help people get to the top, where they may be quitting before the journey's over, I think that could really push human consciousness forward.
Well, when people, up until very recently, whenever you gave a talk, say about psychedelics, you would say, well, there are many ways to get to this same place. And you'd go meditation and chanting and drumming, and fasting and so forth. But the fact is, none of us giving those talks ever liked those methods, or we wouldn't be giving those talks. Okay. I notice if I go to a meditation talk, they don't say there's lots of other ways. They don't say you don't need to meditate. You could take psychedelics. You could do fasting. They never say that. Okay. So what's going on here? What's going on here is culturally, we have a bias against that it isn't difficult. The word shortcut always has a negative connotation.
Mm.
If I want to go, I was looking at a lovely little article that National Geographic put out about going to certain national monuments, things that were national parks, and they took away their park because they couldn't staff them or political changes, but they're still wonderful places to go to. And they mentioned that there was two places which were very popular and were similar. One was Pikes Peak and one was this other one. And this other one had this dreadful road, which you could barely get up on a four-wheel drive. And Pikes Peak then got a road. And Pikes Peak became insanely popular, and nobody even knows the name of this other one. Okay? So there are people who say, well, you're cheating if you use the road. And the answer is, okay.
We're all going to the same place.
If the goal is to go to the top, I'm not cheating. If the goal is to make it really difficult to get to the top, you're entirely right. And the psychedelic people tend to be the people who say, well, I actually never intended to go to the top anyway. I was just tripping. I just had no idea very often what I was getting into. So it was what's called in the Catholicism gratuitous grace. The Catholics have a problem, which is a bunch of terrible people now and then in history have these incredible mystical breakthroughs. And they're terrible people, according to the church. They're thieves or villains or prostitutes or Jews or, whatever it is. And so Catholicism said, we can't deny the reality of their experiences, but we also are aware that they didn't follow the rules that we give you to get you to those experiences. So we're going to make a category called gratuitous grace, which is you don't deserve it, but sometimes God actually does things that we don't understand. So I love that. See, I love that when people try and deal with, it's true, but it's not in my system. And many, many years ago, we were developing a little test of did you have any belief changes after the mystical experience, which we both obviously have had, changes in belief. And I being a graduate student, I made up a little test of different beliefs that we'd gotten from people who'd been having mystical experiences in our treatment center. And I then gave it to some people, and this wonderful woman came up and said, this item. I said, what's the matter with this item? She said, it's true, but I don't believe it. How should I mark it? Okay. And I looked at her and I said, mark it false. I could have also said mark it true, but it's this wonderful, see, for her, she was incredibly aware of the situation, which is, this is true, but I don't believe it. You've asked me only to mark in one place. Okay. Now, I'd say if I were designing such a test today, I would probably have that category, because that's a wonderful category of where do I get off? Okay, where do I stop believing? And if you talk even among the psychedelic world, there are all kinds of things they don't believe. You know, that they have all their limitations too. And that's perfectly realistic because they're coming at it from my beliefs. For instance, one of the things that I love it when people have a mystical experience and God speaks to them. And I say, what language did God speak? And he always speaks to them in their language. And I think, I bet that's not true. Okay. I bet either God speaks all languages, which is a nice one, or there's a system where the energy is translated into something you can handle. And if you go into Christian mysticism, St. John of the Cross basically says the same thing. He says, if you have a vision of the Archangel Gabriel or the gates of heaven opening, he says, don't be confused. That's not what's going on at all. He says, that's God stepping it down the way we step a transformer down until we get to where you have some metaphors that we can use. So just as God speaks to me in English, and in the Shipibo in Peru, when they're being ayahuasca, the shaman is hearing things in Shipibo. The people around the room from Brooklyn and France and Liberia are hearing it in their language. So that's one of those ways in which we have to understand that even if we've had this incredible transcendental experience, it was filtered down so we could handle it. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. And we're right at an hour. I was wondering if you have the time for a couple more questions. Okay, great. So kind of venturing away from higher dose mystical experiences and going into the realm of microdosing, I've been following your work for a long time, and I think I'm not alone in considering you one of the godfathers of microdosing. So perfect person to ask these questions. And my first introduction to you when I met you at the conference in 2017, the MAPS conference, you and I had a good conversation just out in the hallway outside the presentation center about the idea of performance enhancement through psychedelics. Not only mental performance enhancement, like with the stuff you've studied on creativity and mental flexibility and things like that, but also in my experiences with using it for jiu-jitsu, noticing at least subjective physical performance enhancement. I notice, or I seem to notice, better balance, increased access to my innate strength. That's another one of those governors that I think that our body systems naturally put on us. I think our musculature and skeletal system is actually a lot more capable of lifting and doing more things, but our mental governor sets that limit. So on the microdose, that kind of gets released a little bit. I feel like I have more access to my innate strength, innate cardiovascular, but also for jiu-jitsu, it's a ground fighting art. And so it's very much chess-like. So there's a lot of strategy. There's a lot of creative problem solving. There's a lot of thinking multiple moves ahead and running multiple simulations in your head while responding somatically to your partner and to these energies. And I'm noticing all sorts of benefits from microdosing. I think that in some of the other anecdotal reports, there's quite a few coming from like extreme sport athletes, extreme snowboarders, things like that in the X Games. And I'm hearing it more and more happening in my particular sport of interest in combat sports. So jiu-jitsu, but also in mixed martial arts and like the UFC. I'm connected with some of those fighters in there, and they say that they use it in their training to enhance neural connectivity, to enhance almost like a nootropic.
They say if they do better with it.
Yeah.
And I don't have the whole headline, but it's a wonderful headline because it includes something like LSD helps jiu-jitsu expert whoop ass. Okay, and You know, you got to hand the headline writer something for that. And as you read the article, what this guy says is, as a summary, I used to get silver medals. Now I get gold. Okay, so whatever he's doing, he says microdosing is invaluable in making that shift. Now, he also says he wants to get married microdosing and have a martial arts wedding with everybody tripping. So he's an interesting guy. But what you're noticing in your sport and what you're talking about others is that microdosing, let's be clear, microdosing psychedelics has one defining characteristic: no classical psychedelic effects at all. No visions, no angels, no dramatic insights, no finding what your karmic connections were, no awareness of the divinity of all things. However, if you're a runner, you'll run faster. If you're a chess player, you'll be able to have better strategy. If you're taking analytic chemistry, you'll do better on your tests. It improves your capacity for performance. Now, that in itself should frighten an enormous number of sports organizations. Mm-hmm. Okay? Not only that, but you're taking a substance, let us say LSD, where you're taking 5 millionths of a gram. It's mainly gone from the body in a few hours. And I don't know enough about sports testing, but I bet they don't test for it. And it gives you a clear advantage. So just looking at microdosing in the professional sports arena, it's a disruptor. And we know the other thing, we know is that whether it's legal or not, it will be used.
Yeah, I agree with you that it's a disruptor, but almost at such low potentiality for harm. I see it maybe on the same level as Gatorade. You know, Gatorade in sports, if you have one athlete on Gatorade, the other on water, the one in Gatorade is going to have a clear advantage. So, you know, I see it as innocuous as that, as far as harm goes.
I see it. Oh, absolutely. See, one of the things you look at is what's the risk-benefit ratio. Mm-hmm. The risk of microdosing is incredibly low. High-dose psychedelics, as we know, are among the safest drugs out there in terms of physical problems. Microdosing, being a 10th to a 20th, are much less. It's a successful microdose has no discernible biological effects, meaning your blood pressure doesn't go up and so forth and so on. Now, if your reflexes are 5% faster, that's huge in professional sports. And it needs to be looked at. Now, if we look at it in the academic world, here's two groups of students, and they're identical in terms of their test scores. And now we give one group microdosing, and their test scores go up. Is that fair? Okay. What's the moral issue here? And I recall when I was teaching in design engineering at Stanford, the question at that point was coming on is, could students, now this dates me, could students use mechanical calculators during a test when the other students were using slide rules? And it was an issue because it was clear that students who used the first handheld calculators had an advantage. And then the question we now have, you know, now since knowledge is accessible, you know, most of human knowledge is accessible. A whole lot of the educational system might need to be relooked at. And with microdosing, we're simply looking at if something improves functioning, what does the culture do with that? Given that the things you're using to improve functioning, a lot of them are still, for reasons that have nothing to do with science, illegal.
Yeah, and so that's a big part of my own lens coming at it from a social work perspective, is this social justice moralistic piece. I'm a believer that we as humans innately should have freedom over our own consciousness and the ability to explore it or manipulate it in whatever way we want. And right now we're being restricted with that in sports and in academia and things like that. So this moralistic issue, I think, comes down to, are the powers that be going to allow us to start, to give us the reins over our own consciousness? And that's a big issue.
Well, I think there are three basic freedoms. One is the freedom to know God. I think that you should be allowed to approach divinity, whatever you mean by that, if you don't hurt anybody. I think you need to have the freedom to discover what the physical, material, biological world is, called science. You need not to be prevented from studying or learning about anything. And I think you should have the freedom inside yourself to improve yourself. Mm-hmm. Any civilization that restricts the freedom to know divinity, the freedom to know the world, and the freedom to know yourself is a society which will be superseded by a better one. Mm-hmm. So that's a kind of strong claim. But that's really where I'm coming from. That's my basics. And so my career has been to make it easier for people to have those three freedoms. And if you can't know yourself because you're in trauma, well, I support things that release trauma. If you can't study certain kinds of science because it's against the political or the moral or the religious system, that needs to be opened. And in terms of rediscovering your connection to divinity, by now I have to say that should be obvious.
Yeah, and I wanted to share a story with you too, about my, I guess, more recent microdosing and jiu-jitsu combination. And so I had a professional jiu-jitsu match last February in Denver. And I didn't win the match, but it was a hard fought battle, very challenging, very good match, back and forth. And afterwards, I'm still feeling good from the microdose. And I come to find out through, most of my opponents become my friends after we share that kind of struggle on the mat together. We end up being friends, and I really like that about our sport. And so I reached out to him on Facebook and told him about that night. And I said, look, man, I was on a microdose of LSD that night. And, and he just happened to say, hey, I was microdosing that night too on psilocybin. And so we both had a good laugh, and it seemed like it was almost like a battle of the molecules that night. And psilocybin won out, unfortunately for me that night, but it was a great connection just to see, like, two opponents at this high level coming together with no previous contact with each other. I mean, as opponents, you don't talk to them. And then we come to the mat having different but similar experiences and intentions. And then afterwards, that becomes a more connecting, bonding experience between the two of us. I actually had him on the podcast a couple of episodes ago to talk about that. It was really cool.
That's wonderful, because what's happened in the culture is, in spite of the fact that, quote, these are, quote, illegal, it's basically ignored because it's not harming people and it benefits. Now, there was a period in American history where they prohibited alcohol. Mm-hmm. What happened in that period is drinking went up. Alcohol was sold in more and more condensed forms. It's easier to transport vodka than a bunch of beer. And I think my favorite statistic was, around Times Square in New York, before Prohibition, there was 500 places you could have a drink. During Prohibition, there was 2,000. Okay? So a culture, in spite of its legal restrictions, people don't like their consciousness restricted in either direction. So the fact that this wonderful, you with your secret powers find that your opponent who you've never met from some other part of the country has the same secret powers suggests that in the brotherhood of your martial art, it's already understood that we've equalized the playing field. So we're still back to who is better that evening at that particular time. And that I love that story, okay? Because what it says to me is microdosing has entered the culture, and the fact that it happens to be illegal seems to matter less and less. There's an article that I just love, which is about the trivialization of this. And it's the question of, should you have microdosing on your first date? And the woman who wrote the article said that she was in college, early college, and she was invited to sex parties where you're supposed to hook up with someone. And she went to 3 of them and never connected to anybody. And she said, it could have been because I don't drink and I don't smoke pot. She said, but the 4th party I microdosed and I had my first hookup. And then she interviews about lower anxiety to make them feel just more comfortable without a heavy sexual connotation. But as I read the article, I thought, the research will eventually come, but so much later. See, one of the things is science has this fantasy. See, if you listen to scientists, they say, well, we can't say anything about microdosing because we don't have a double-blind study. And I think, are you saying you're not able to speak about human experience until there's a double-blind study? And some of them kind of say yes. You know, they say, that's the only way I can think. And I think, well, if you were an Orthodox Jew or a fanatic Muslim or a Shiva worshiper or an evangelical Christian, you would have the same comment, which is, there are certain ways I have to think of things, and that's the way it is. And that's not harmful. When you're work, it's silly. For instance, I don't think there's ever been a double-blind study about people putting their tongues in each other, but it still seems to be done.
Yeah, and
So I don't worry about the science. I worry about the cultural effects and the cultural results, and that seems to be doing well.
And you bring up a good point about the randomized control trials. I think there was a guy recently who published a self-study, randomized blinded study on microdosing and reported no benefits. I think his name was Gwern. But again, you know, you bring up a good point that if you are locked into this reality where you have to have scientific evidence to inform your decisions day to day, then that's where you're at. For me, I have way more anecdotal evidence that says it does work, and it works for me, whether it's placebo or not, and it's definitely not. You know, I can still look at that scientific study and question it.
Well, actually, if you read his study very carefully, his bias that it isn't going to work gets louder and louder. And it's a fascinating study because he really does a very good job of setting up a potentially real double blind, but we're talking not about a very large effect. And since now, you know, if you go to Reddit, Reddit has a subreddit called microdosing. There's 88,000 people on it. So probably it's not, and if it is, you see, if it's a placebo, as one of our subjects said, I don't care if it's a placebo. I haven't felt this good in 30 years. And the word placebo actually is a terrible word because it's a kind of biased word. We're against it. The correct term is called natural healing response. And the natural healing response, anything that you can do that brings that on, is beneficial. So when you've microdosed and then get on the mat, your natural healing response improves your flexibility, your reflexes, and your sense of strategy. And you know, I would love it if actually microdoses simply were the best placebo we've ever developed.
Yeah, I agree. And whether it's placebo or not, if it works, and it gets us to the top of the mountain. I'll get to the top of the mountain with a placebo.
Exactly. Exactly. So again, that's the science game is in its rules. In a sense, double blind has kind of gotten a lot more credit for being valuable than it is. its actual use is if you have two substances, say antidepressants, and you want to sell this new one. You want to do a study against the old one and the new one to show whether your new one is any better. That's a good use of a double blind because you're choosing between similar things. And when someone says, well, we need a double blind study, I say, well, let me give you an example where I don't think you need a double blind study. Here is a foam, kind of a foam bat, and here's a 2x4. Now, I'm going to hit you over the head with one or the other. Do you really think we need to do this study? Okay, or would you, in advance, make an educated guess that one of them will have more of an effect? Okay, and so you have to look at when science or religion, any dogma, any dogmatic system says this has to be, that's a place to look, because then you're finding the bias, not necessarily the best answer.
Yeah.
And I know that if they do a bunch of studies and find that that there's no effect of microdosing, it will change nobody's behavior. Sure. You know, just as if they found out that putting your tongue in someone's mouth doesn't lead to pregnancy, people will still go for it. So.
Yeah, you have the best metaphors. I'm going to use some of them. So I wanted to just say real quick that article that you mentioned about the jiu-jitsu fighter and the microdosing, that was actually me in the article. Yeah. So that was written about me, and a lot of those things came true. I did get married. My wife and I both took microdoses on the day of the wedding. Not the whole crowd was microdosing, but a good number of them were microdosing something. And we did get married in our jiu-jitsu gis. I'll send you pictures. It was a great experience. So that article, you know, I was set when they interviewed me for that. I was set on those intentions, and I made them happen.
Oh, I think that is that's the kind of science I like, which is I love that article, and mainly because what I wanted to do is put it in a scientific journal with the headline, because I just love the headline about can whoop ass, because that's not the kind of reference that you find in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. So part of my loving that article was the headline, because it was not surprising to me that someone, I'm so happy it was you. That's such a fun. And I'm so glad you got married and you did it as you wished. Oh, I'd say if we needed to have an ending, that's fantastic.
Yeah. So do you see good things for us in the future? Good things coming from this this new renaissance? And what are maybe some of the things we need to watch out for?
Well, what's happening now is the vultures of greed have flown in, and there's now a venture fund for psychedelics. There are laboratories who are trying to develop alternative substances, either to avoid to get patents, but also there's a whole bunch of them saying, well, I want to make a psychedelic which has no psychedelic mental effects.
Yep.
And my feeling is, I was distressed at that, but I talked to one of my friends. He said, well, it isn't going to change spiritual experiences, because we're all going to use the real thing. The decriminalization, the saying that nature, it's a wonderful notion that you decriminalize nature. This is a huge shift. And it's something I've said for years, is the wonderful thing about mushrooms is they don't know they're illegal. For instance, they grow all over England. There's something called fairy caps, and they're a psychedelic mushroom, and they grow all over England, regardless of what the laws are. There's 100 different psilocybin species around the planet. You can buy on Amazon a number of active psychedelics. You can buy the ayahuasca vine. You can buy the San Pedro cactus, which has mescaline. You can buy something called a Peruvian torch, which is another cactus, which is even stronger. This is on Amazon. Okay, this is when the substances in them are, you know, are Schedule 1, no known use. Okay, except for the few thousand years of use. So we're at a kind of silly time in the legal point, and that science is catching up with. It hasn't begun to catch up with the indigenous culture, but it is catching up with the culture. And I hope it goes faster. And someone said to me, will there be misuse of psychedelics? And the answer is absolutely. Absolutely. There'll be terrible things that I will just feel terrible about. And that's the way it goes. Marijuana now has become, you know, uh, candies. Okay, that's not exactly the sacred use of the plant. And it turns out you can now use yeast to create THC and CBD. So you don't need the plant at all. And there's also a synthesis of psilocybin the same way, starting with bacteria. So we in the West will screw around with it and distort it in every possible way. And thank goodness the plants will just continue producing plants. And the fungus will keep producing mushrooms. And the people who meet at the top of the mountain, on the whole, won't care how they got there. But they will be, when you talk to mountaineers or long distance runners or people in your sport, which is a combat sport, you say, we become friends. So people who take psychedelics will continue to become friends. And there will be less depression. We now have a way for depression, for migraines, probably for cluster headaches, for all kinds of things that people shouldn't need to suffer from. That's all going to happen regardless of the laws. And once I got that probably psychedelics will be accelerated as soon as greed enters the situation. Look what happened with marijuana. Sure, it'll be misused. Everything can be. Will it be also used correctly? Yes. And will psychologists need to take into account more of consciousness? Yes. Will psychiatrists need to take in more of consciousness? Yes. Will physicians need to take in more of the biome and its little 1,000 species of bacteria than the brain? Probably yes. That feels all kind of fun and beneficial. Will we outlast climate change? Ask me in 1,000 years and I'll tell you.
Yeah. Great. Well, I want to say thank you again for spending so much time with me today. And it's always wonderful to talk to you. I wish I got more and more opportunities to talk to you. Hopefully I'll see you at some conferences next year or something like that. But I just want to say deepest gratitude for your insights and the work that you've done over your entire career. I know for me, you have been an instrumental person mentoring me through your writings and things like that, and have helped shaped me into the potential psychedelic researcher that I'm striving to be. I want to be that new generation that takes the torch and moves the field and human consciousness forward.
Well, you're doing what you're doing with your life, in a sense, validates mine. Okay? It's like I've been throwing out a lot of seeds, and you young trees make all the difference. So, and what a pleasure. And also, I'm just so charmed and delighted by my favorite headline being you.
Yeah.
So it's one of those fiction. There's a fiction story about two people in a bookstore who are online, having a relationship with someone, and a graduate. That's the way I feel.
That's great.
Okay.
Well, thanks again, Jim, and I'll send you those wedding pictures so you can see. It was really cool.
Terrific. Okay.
Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.